So I want to start my talk off today by creating a little bit of nostalgic anxiety in all of you. And if for whatever reason you can't relate to this, it's great, I'm glad to hear it. But I really encourage you to try to imagine alongside me because I think it'll make my point later on a little bit more clear. So I want you to imagine that you're back in high school, or if you had a good time in high school, ignore that. You're back in middle school. And let's say that you're sitting in your least favorite class with your least favorite teacher, surrounded by your least favorite people. Now let's say you're sitting in the third row because you don't want to sit in the first row to draw too much attention to yourself, but you don't want to sit all the way in the back to make it look like you're actively avoiding trying to participate, which of course you are. Now unfortunately, your plan ended up not working out because the first two seats directly in front of you are empty. So every time your teacher asks a question, it's as if they're looking directly into your eyes, as if they already know you don't know the answer, and they would be right. Now, to make matters worse, let's say today's a Tuesday. It's objectively the worst day because it's not the first day of the week, but you still have a mountain left to climb. And on this particular Tuesday, you're getting back a crazy difficult test that's cutting for a ridiculous amount of your final grade. Now, after a deep breath, you might be thinking, man, things are looking pretty bad right now, but they could get worse. Because you get your test back, you look at the top of the paper, and you do extremely poorly, right? So you start to go through it and try to figure out where you went wrong. But after probably a couple of seconds, you realize there's 4 or 5 students who start to do something like this, right? So they're sitting down, because this is how students sit, and they're doing something like weird with the neck, or they're doing some sort of like lizard, like glances from one side to another. And what they're trying to do is compare what they got to what you got. And so it really is inadvertently human nature to try to compare ourselves to those who are most relevant to us in our lives. And traditional schools are a particularly good feeding ground for this because not only can we do something along these lines or have that really uncomfortable conversation like, oh, what did you get? But you also have this overarching standard that everyone is compared to. And this is in the form of either standardized tests or anything related that are set by policymakers and educators alike. And so looking back at what was really uncomfortable about this whole process for me wasn't whether or not I was doing well, but rather it didn't feel like a valid measure for me to either consciously or unconsciously compare myself to those around me. And that's because when we do poorly on a test, we're really encouraged to try to dig into the reasons why we might not have done very well. And so if we're trying to rationalize a poor performance on a test, we can really come up with an infinite amount of reasons why that might have happened. So maybe we weren't feeling well, we're not clicking with the teacher, we didn't study in the right way, whatever it is. But really what we're saying here is if we account for the things that might have affected us, then maybe we would have done better. And so this is the very idea I've been obsessed with for quite a while, and it's how can we really be sure our tests are reflecting what we think that they do? So over the last 6 months, I had the wonderful opportunity to be a contracted researcher. And basically my job was pretty simple, albeit dry. So the first one was to closely read the legislation, understand its goals and aims, and then I quote, to identify and propose areas in education that could be supplemented by the integration of nonprofits and other service providers. So as you can imagine, it was kind of gross, but a couple things that I learned from it seemed to be really important, and I wanted to share them with you all today. And so the first thing is that ESSA focuses on school accountability, right? So it removes the strict standards that used to be in place and allows for states to define their own ambitious educational goals. And what's more is it also allows states to define the rulers by which to measure progress towards those goals in the form of standardized tests. And so a related consequence of this is that states are encouraged to avoid unnecessary testing of students, which is something we haven't seen for quite a while, particularly with No Child Left Behind. So an example of this is in my home state of New Hampshire. We recently moved away from a test called Smarter Balance and instead opted for College Board's SAT. And so this is really great because not only do we have students who might be interested in going to college who are getting a free SAT under their belt, but they're also able to get their state mandatory testing out of the way at the same time. And so another thing that I want to point out as I'm going down the list that ESSA does really well is that it really puts a new spin on how we actually test students. So it encourages 7 different states to be innovative with the process and center it around student-centered learning. And so this is really important because ESSA is a law that focuses on equitability of education, so particularly for students who are traditionally disadvantaged. So those might be students who are living with a disability, those who come from a low impoverished background, whatever it might be. But what I'm worried about, and the more time I spent with the law, is that while we might be making a lot of progress, I was worried whether or not we're making progress in the right direction. And that's because when we're requiring states to define their own ambitious goals, and we're allowing them the means to measure progress towards those goals, we're really having them over-rely on the results of those tests in terms of what they tell them. And so this is a problem we've seen before, particularly with the No Child Left Behind Act. And you might think, well, at first, this is okay, because these are valid tests that individuals put a lot of energy into in terms of making sure they measure what they're supposed to. But the problem is that validity is not static. It's something that can change. And so I really want to switch to this idea of what is validity, because technically there's an entire field of discourse dedicated to this word, but for the purposes of this talk, I really just want to simply define it as if a test measures what it's supposed to measure in the relevant domain of student attributes. And so something outside of the world of education that might be a good candidate for this might be that of when we go and get our driver's test. So when we sit down for the written portion of the test, if we get a 100% on that, we would expect that someone who gets behind the wheel of a car to fare pretty well. But the problem is that, once again, if we over-rely on the results of a test, its validity can change. And this leads to a concept known as test score pollution, which is when the results of a test and what they tell us and what we can use them for changed on the environmental circumstances that they're subjected to. And so going back to our driver's example, I was very careful to say that if you get a 100% on the written portion of your test, it should be related to how well you do when you get behind the wheel. But if I was standing up here and I told you all that getting 100% on the written test would guarantee that you're going to pass your practical, you'd probably say that's a little crazy. And that's because anyone who's actually gotten behind the wheel of a car knows that it's something that has to become second nature to us. And so when we go back into this world of education, we're kind of presented with a huge balancing act, right? Because on the one side, we have these rationalizations we talked about before, but brought to a much greater extreme. So instead of someone who might not be doing well on a test because they're not feeling well, they're not clicking with the teacher, instead we have someone who might be underperforming due to, let's say, their socioeconomic status and or their cultural upbringing. And so again, these are essentially the different factors that affect someone's ability to perform based on what they were subjected to growing up or while being enrolled in a school. And so on the other side, we have what I call peripheral normative skews. And these are what are essentially the standards themselves that we have deemed virtuous for students to try to reach for. The problem with this, though, is when it's taken to its extreme, is it creates a concept known as teaching to the test. And so this is a problem because while we have students who might be performing well on a test, it might not actually reflect their body of knowledge that they are accruing. And so the more time that I spent with ESSA as a law and kind of looking at the different data in front of me, I realized that there's a seesaw effect between these two. And there are trade-offs in either direction that we go. So when we focus on too much of accounting for the intersectional background of students and the different baggage that they might be bringing into a given test environment, the less we can really know about how much a given curriculum is having an effect on them. But on the other side, when we account too much for the standards themselves, we're kind of ignoring the individual experience that students are bringing with them that are either helping them do better or worse on that given test. So in either circumstance, we really don't know how the students are faring. And so this is a concept that I call the skewed value hypothesis, which is something that I really want to dig into now that my case study is over. But you might be questioning, well, what does this really have to do with ESSA and education today? And so unsurprisingly, we find that we're more towards this side over here, which again is the side when it's taken to its extreme, we find that we're teaching to the test. So I'm very concerned that while ESSA is taking a huge step forward in terms of meeting 21st century needs and 21st century differences, it's leaving one foot firmly in the past, making our system unbalanced. And so what can we really do to fix this? I would say that first we need to acknowledge that we need to consider the systems that we put in place as people and understand that there's always consequences, whether good or bad, that we didn't see going forward. And so acknowledging that we have these two different variables that we oscillate between, we need to understand that we can better balance these two. And so one thing that kind of became apparent to me is that equity is found in the day-to-day. And this is something that I've heard a million times from a million different people, but most recently from Pender Macon, who I sat down with earlier this year in discussing my research. And one thing that we brainstormed that I really liked is when we're assessing students, we want to put qualitative measures back in with the quantitative. And this is important because it allows us to really understand the experience of students and to allow them to speak for themselves in terms of their needs rather than speaking for them. And so this might seem a little abstract, right? Because you're like, well, how can we do this? But a couple of different measures that have already been put into place that I'm a fan of is we do a stratified random sample of different essays, portfolios, direct observation groups, et cetera, et cetera. And so one way that this differs from what we're already doing, because you might say, well, on the SAT, for example, we have an essay portion. But they're always lined up with some sort of quantitative measure, so a rubric of some sort, et cetera, et cetera. And so when we move away from that and truly have qualitative measures, we're able to accomplish what that information was supposed to tell us in the first place. And it's to better understand how people learn things and then be able to put them into a format that has value to themselves or to their communities at large. And so I really want to encourage you all to understand that when we put people first and leave systems second, and that we don't have to be married to static numbers to create positive change, then we can leave that nostalgic anxiety in the past and truly make our educational system work for everyone. Thank you.